Hi everyone, in this video we're going to learn about the axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton, as you can see in this picture, is composed of the yellow highlighted regions, which are the skull, the thoracic cage, and the vertebra. Today's video, we're going to focus primarily on the bones that make up the skull and the facial bones. So we're going to focus up here today, and then in the next video about the axial skeleton, we'll do the remaining parts. So the functions of today's lab is to examine not only the bone, but the features of the bone. And your goal is to look at bones that are articulated and disarticulated. Bones that are articulated, you're going to see that it's connected to another bone via a joint. And disarticulated bones are separated, where we're just looking at it by itself. And in addition to that, you need to know the difference between the cranial bones and the facial bones. We're going to do both cranial and facial bones together. It's not that we're doing cranial bones first and facial. It's going to be going back and forth. But let's go ahead and start with one cranial bone first. This is going to be the frontal bone. So the frontal bone, as you see, it is the plate that makes up the very beginning portion of your skull. And inside the frontal bone is going to house the frontal portion, the frontal lobe of your brain. So this is the frontal lobe right here. This is the frontal bone. This is looking at it from an anterior view. From the side view, you can see that this is the frontal bone. And in this 3D animation right here, you can see that this is the frontal bone. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the features of the frontal bone. In the frontal bone, you have the glabella. The glabella is this ridge right here in the frontal bone. It's pretty much the area between the eyebrows, and it has many functions. One of the main functions is that it provides support for the forehead and the eyebrow muscles, so therefore it's going to have a heavy role in your facial expressions. And sometimes physicians or nurses will gently tap this area, this glabella area, to see if you have a reflex. If someone taps this area, one of your reflex may be to squint. So a reflex can be used to test to see if all your nerve endings are working here, and it would be called the glabella tap reflex. Now we're going to move a little bit down, and what you can see are these two tiny notches right here. The tiny notch, these are called the supraorbital foramen. The supraorbital foramen notch is, as you can say that as well, but these are the notches that you see right here. So essentially, this is a small opening in the frontal bone, and it's located right above the eye socket. The primary function of it is to allow for nerve arteries and veins to pass through. And these blood vessels and these nerves are going to provide a sensory innervation that takes the nerve ending and blood to and from the forehead, eyelid, and pretty much the anterior scalp. So this is the supraorbital foramen. Now, this region right here, it's one of the sinuses that we have. This is going to be the frontal sinus. It's this region right here. So it's not an actual bone. A sinus is a cavity. So the two frontal sinuses here, there are going to be the area that is filled with cell that makes mucus. And this is going to be important because the mucus is going to prevent your nose from drying out. And then finally, this portion right here is the orbital socket. Okay, so on top of the orbital socket, we still have a portion that's connected to the frontal bone. So this right here is the orbital plate of the frontal bone. Now this is the orbital cavity, so right here would be the orbital plate of the frontal bone. So this is the orbital plate of the frontal bone. Now I want to move into mentioning very quickly the cheekbone. Okay? We're not at the cheekbone yet, but your cheekbone would be right here. So this would be the cheekbone. Now, there are going to be processes, they're pretty much extension that comes out from your cheekbone. One of the extension you can see right here highlighted in red. This is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. We're going to examine many zygomatic processes in today's video, but wherever your cheekbone are, okay, this right here from this view is showing you the zygomatic process, and since it's connected to the frontal bone, it is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. So it's this region right here. And this diagram, from the frontal view, from the anterior view, you can see it on this side right here. There's one here and then on the other side. Okay. All right, next I would like to move into the maxillary bone. The maxillary bone is the bone, it's also known as the maxilla, as you can see right here. It is the bone that is making the that's forming the upper jaw, the roof of the mouth, and you can also see that it's also part of the eye socket and nose as well. And the main function of the maxilla bone is to hold the teeth in place and help support the muscles that is involving for chewing and facial expression of your mouth. Overall, it's pretty much the major bone in our face. So let's go ahead and examine some features of the maxillary bone. You can see right here that this is going to be the frontal process. The frontal process right here is also known as the nasal process because it's close to your nose. It's pretty much a bony structure that if you take a look, it projects upwards, and this is going to form the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and it's pretty much made of a very strong plate that is going to help define and give structure to your overall nasal region. So this right here is the frontal process. Then if we move a little bit towards this way, you can see that this is the orbital plate of the maxillary bone. In this diagram, it would be this area right here. Now remember, this is the eye socket, this is the orbital socket, and if this entire thing is the maxillary bone, this portion right here that connects to this orbital socket, this is going to be the orbital plate of the maxillary bone. Then we can also move into this region right here. We also have the sinuses in this area. This is going to be the maxillary sinus. The maxillary sinus, again, it's a sinus, so it's in cavity. It's not really well defined, but one of the main functions, or one of the things that people suggest that the function could be, is to help humidify the air, and it could also help contribute to your voice resonance as well. So this is the maxillary sinus. And then you also have these tiny holes as well. So these holes are called the infraorbital foramen. The word foramen, if you haven't seen the pattern yet, anytime we hear the word foramen, it's going to suggest an opening. So the infraorbital foramen right here, this opening is going to serve as a passageway for infraorbital nerve, artery, and veins to go through. And these blood vessels and nerves are going to provide sensory innervation to the midface, including the lower eyelid and the cheek, along with the nose as well. And then moving down here, we have the alveolar margin. The alveolar margin is also known as the you can hear people refer to it as the process as well, but pretty much it is the rim. It's the rim of bones that are the closest to your teeth. And later on, we're going to see the actual alveolar process, which is an even thicker ridge. So you'll hear the word alveolar margin and alveolar process being used interchangeably, but essentially there's a little bit minor of a difference. The alveolar margin, it's the rim of the bones that's closest to the crown of your teeth. And the process is going to be a thicker ridge where your tooth is going to come out of. So right here is the alveolar margin. Now, if you take the skull and you tilt it so you're looking at it from an inferior view, part of the maxillary bone from this view, you can see another hole called the incisive fossa. This is essentially a bony depression that's found at the roof of your mouth. So this is the palate of your mouth, and it's still a part of the maxillary bone, the maxilla, because you can see that the maxillary bone, there's a view of it from the posterior view, and here we're looking at a part of the maxillary bone from the inferior view, and you can see the incisive fossa here. And there's going to be blood and vessel that goes in and out here, which provide movement and provide oxygen to go to your nasal cavity. And this portion of the palate of your mouth is called the palatine process, and this palatine process is a part of the maxilla. It's a part of the maxillary bone, and it's going to help with the separation of the oral and the nasal cavity. It also serves as a base for your upper teeth and your tongue. So now we're going to move into the temporal bones. We have two temporal bones, one on each side of our face. Now, of a side of our head. So with the temporal bone, as you can see here, you need to understand how to view it from the lateral view, which is a side view. This is a side view right here. But you should also understand how to view it from the medial view, which is looking at it from the midline out. In addition to that, you have to understand and differentiate the difference between the left and the right temporal bone. So here we are looking at the right temporal bone. So this right here is the right temporal bone, and we're looking at it from the lateral view. And you can see here that this is it from an actual skull without any highlighted. So this is the temporal bone here, and this is looking at it from the lateral view. You can take the bone out, so this would be a disarticulated temporal bone. This is what it looks like if you remove it from the head. Now, from the medial view, which is looking at from the midline in, this would be still the right temporal bone, but you're looking at it from the middle part outwards. So let's start with the lateral view first of the right temporal bone. How you can differentiate between right and left is go ahead and find where the zygomatic process of the temporal bone is at. This right here is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This right here is the zygomatic process. Whenever the zygomatic process is pointing to the right hand side, as you see here, this is moving to the right hand side. This suggests to you that this is going to be the right temporal bone. If you take a look at the left temporal bone, now the zygomatic process is pointing to the left hand side. So this is the left temporal bone. Okay? And also this is the lateral view. So let's go ahead and move back to the right temporal bone and go over the structures. So with the temporal bone, you can see that there is going to be the external acoustic meatus here that's visible in the lateral view, and this is essentially your ear canal where sound wave comes in. Okay? There's going to be some trap particle that's inside of this external acoustic meatus. In addition to that, if you were to take the temporal bone and flip it, so you're looking at it from the medial view, so this is the midline looking out, we now have the internal acoustic meatus. This is a passageway in the temporal bone that allows for the transmission of nerve and blood vessels that are involved in hearing. So you have the external acoustic meatus, which is visible from the lateral view, and then from the medial view, you have the internal acoustic meatus. The petrous region is pretty much this entire region right here. This is the petrous region, and this region pretty much contains all the inner part of the inner ear, which are the cochlear, the vestibulary, the semicircular canal. This region is all the way inside of your ear, and this is the region that is pretty much responsible for hearing and balance. So you have the petrous region right here. Now, moving into this side, you can see that this is the mastoid process. The mastoid process is going to be an area as attachment. You're going to see that the mastoid process connects to other muscles of the head and the neck. So it serves as an attachment site for all the other muscles that we'll study once we get to the muscle chapter. Now, we also have the styloid process. The styloid process is this tip right here, and you can see the stylus process here and the styloid process here. The styloid process serves also as a point of attachment for other muscles and ligaments of the head and neck, and it also can help with swallowing and tongue movement as well for those muscles that are attached here. And then we also can see the mandibular fossa, which is this indent right here. It's a concave depression, and this is going to form many joints. It's going to be a part of the temporal mandibular joint, and you'll see here that it's going to be an area of an attachment to the mandible, which is the lower jaw. Okay. And then finally, we are going to examine the left side of the bone. Now, actually, since we already done the right side, I actually want you to take what you learned, and you should be able to apply this information to the left side as well. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move into the next bone that we're going to look at, which will be actually, before we move into the mandible, there are still some parts of the temporal bone that we actually have to examine. So far, if you take a look, I've only showed it to you from the lateral and the medial view. There are some other structures that we have to identify as well, but you cannot see it until you take a look at the temporal bone from the inferior view. So this is the inferior view of the skull, but remember the temporal bone is going to be located right here and also right here. So from this interior view, hopefully you can see that there's still the styloid process that is very visible, which is the very pointy structure right here. But in addition to that, you can also see a part of the mastoid process as well. So the mastoid process here and the mastoid process here. So essentially, this is the styloid process, and this is the mastoid process right here. And you can still see it from the inferior view. Now, some other structures that are important and part of the temporal bone that is not visible from the lateral or the medial view would be the styloid mastoid foramen. So it's this hole right here, and there's also another one on this side as well. So go ahead and find where the styloid process is at, and then right under it is the styloid mastoid foramen. So the styloid mastoid foramen, again, it's a foramen, so it's going to be a small opening in the temporal bone, and it's located, as you can see, at the base of the styloid process and the mastoid process. And this is going to be an exit point for many facial nerves, such as the cranial nerve 7 and other styloid mastoid artery. Now, if there were to be any damage in this area, the blood vessels and the nerve cannot run through as efficient, so there may be some inflammation, which can contribute to partial facial paralysis, and this can lead to conditions such as Bell palsy, where you lose movement in an area of your face. And then two other openings that I want to mention are going to be these opening right here. Okay, so this opening right here is called the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen is essentially located at the base of the skull. And this opening is going to, again, serve as a passageway of many cranial nerves, and in addition to the cranial nerves moving in and out, this pathway houses the jugular vein, which is a blood vessel that takes deoxygenated blood from your head back down to your heart so that it can get oxygenated. Now, right next to the jugular foramen, there's going to be the carotid canal. The carotid canal is an opening again that allows for the passageway of the carotid artery. The carotid artery is a blood vessel that takes oxygenated rich blood from the heart, and it's going to take that blood and supply it to your head so that your head, your brain, can receive oxygenated blood in order to function. So again, we have the styloid process, the mastoid process. The opening in between these two processes is called the styloid mastoid foramen. It's this tiny opening right here. And then we have the jugular foramen, and then we have the carotid canal. All right, and that concludes the temporal bone. Now let's move into the occipital bone. The occipital bone is going to be the plate that is at the back of the skull. So this is the occipital bone right here. And the occipital bone is going to help with support of many regions in the back of your skull. Now, some key features of the occipital bone are going to be some lines and ridges. Now, if you take a closer look here, you can see that there is a line that's going horizontally in the occipital bone. There's also another line that's going horizontally that is going in the bottom part. So there's a top line and a bottom line. So this top line right here, let me see if I can highlight it for you. So let's go ahead and do this yellow highlighter, okay? So this top line right here is going to be the superior nuchal line. So this bony ridge that we see right here of the occipital bone is going to again be a site of attachment for other muscles and ligaments that are involved with head and neck movement, and it serves as a landmark as well. So it's going to be very important for supplying muscle attachment for head stability. Then we have the line on the bottom, which is shown right here. So this, since it's on the bottom, it's going to be the inferior nuchal line. It's also going to serve as an additional site of many muscles that's going to control head movement along with body posture as well. So again, this is located on the bottom. So this is the superior nuchal line and this is the inferior nuchal line. Now, if we go back to the superior nuchal line, this portion right here in the middle, okay, this is actually called the external occipital protuberance. This external occipital protuberance is pretty much a bony bump that's located in the posterior surface of the occipital bone. And it is a normal anatomical feature that you can feel. So if you take your hand and put it in the back of your head and you feel this bump, that is the external occipital protuberance, and it serves as a landmark. Then if you see, there's this line going all the way down. Okay, so this landmark right here that is going all the way down is called the external occipital crest. Now this is the bony ridge on the back of your skull, and it's like the previous ones, it's also going to serve as a site for muscle attachment. Then from this view, you can see this very big opening. This very big opening is called the foramen magnum. I'll show you an image of the foramen magnum in other views, but this is the foramen magnum right here. And out of all the openings that we've looked at so far, this is the biggest opening because it's the main passageway for the connection between the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. And this is going to be the area where your brainstem attaches to, which houses the medulla portion, and it's pretty much a very large opening. And next to the foramen magnum, you can see this right here. This is called the occipital condyle. So there's two. There's one on the left and one on the right. And the occipital condyle is going to articulate with the first vertebra. And we'll talk more about the occipital condyle when I show you how it meets and articulate with C1, which is the cervical vertebra 1. Okay. Now I want to show you some other view of the occipital bone. So if you take a look at it from this view, you can still see the foramen magnum. Okay, so it's still this hole right there. And in addition to that, you can also see the occipital condyle as well. So again, this would be the foramen magnum. This is the skull from the inferior view, and from the posterior view, sorry, this should say posterior view, not anterior. So from the posterior view, you can also see the foramen magnum. And in addition to that, this is the occipital condyle, where it's going to articulate with cervical vertebra 1. Now, one more opening that is hard to see, that opening is actually in the occipital condyle. So if I take the skull and I tilt it this way, okay, you can see this is the back of the skull, this is the front. Now, this is still the inferior view, so you're looking at it from the bottom up. But from this view, hopefully you can see that there's this opening right here within the occipital condyle. This right here is the hypoglossal canal. The hypoglossal canal is again within the occipital condyle, and there's going to be nerve that travels through here, which supply innervation that gives movement to your tongue. And there's also going to be communication between your the main area of your brain and the brainstem through the nerve that travels here as well. And again, if there are any nerve damage here, you can also get paralysis in your tongue movement as well, because there are nerve that goes to your tongue that runs through here. And many evolutionary biologists, when they're studying the hypoglossal canal, they do see a correlation in species that have a larger hypoglossal canal. They tend to be species that have more complex speech, which is something that's found in hominids. Okay. All right, and now let's move into the nasal bone. So the nasal bone is a pair of two small bones that you see here. It's clear in this GIF that is moving, but essentially it's this portion right here. This is the nasal bone. So the nasal bone right here, it's pretty much two small pair of oblong bones, so they're pretty long. It's located in the upper part of the face, and it's going to join together to form the bony part of your nasal bridge, your nose bridge right here. So this right here is the nasal bone. So this region right here is the nasal bone. Again, more visible in this rotating diagram. So with the nasal bone, underneath it, we also have the vomer bone. Now, the vomer bone is one single piece of bone. So unlike the nasal bone that I showed you earlier, which is two bones that are connected, the vomer bone is a very thin and flat bone that you see right here. And from this diagram, you can see that this portion right here is the vomer bone. The entire thing here is not the vomer bone. The vomer bone is only this small portion on the bottom part, and you can see that it's this area right here, just that small portion. The rest of it is seen from another view. So this portion right here is the vomer bone, not the entire thing, just this portion. And from the posterior view, you can see right here that this is part of the vomer bone. So vomer bone here as well. All right, so I know this is a little bit random that's thrown in, but I want to show you the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a U-shaped bone, and it's found located in the front of the neck just below the jaw, as you can see here. So from this diagram, this is the hyoid bone right here, and this is the hyoid bone right here. And out of all the bones, this is a very unique bone because it doesn't articulate directly with any other bone in your body. Instead, it serves as a supported site for ligaments and muscles. And because of this, the hyoid bone is actually very involved with speech. It helps with swallowing, and it can also provide head support as well. So this is the hyoid bone. All right, now I want to examine the palatine bone. So the palatine bone, as what you can see here, is a pear bone that's located in the back of your nasal cavity. So you cannot see the palatine bone directly looking at someone. It's all the way in the back. And what it really looks like if you see is that it actually forms an L shape, like the L letter, I should say. And because of this, there's going to be the vertical plate, which goes up and down, and then the horizontal plate. Okay. From the inferior view of the skull, you can see the palatine bone right here, the bottom portion of it, and this right here would be the horizontal plate right here. And the horizontal plate would be here, and this would be the vertical plate. So this is the palatine bone. All right, so now we're going to move into the actual cheekbone. So this is the zygomatic bone, which are your cheekbone, and this is something where you may have heard some people have higher cheekbones than other. So this is the cheekbone right here. This is your cheekbone. This is the cheekbone right here. So cheekbone, and then you have the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone. So this is the orbital socket right here. Okay, so this would be the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone. We talked about all the orbital plate so far. So this right here, they're all orbital plate, but since it's the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone, it's going to be right here that actually touches the zygomatic bone. While on top here, that would be the orbital plate of the frontal bone, because this is the frontal bone. And the other one that we saw earlier, it's the orbital plate of the maxillary bone, because this is the maxillary bone. So here, this is the zygomatic bone. So this area right here is the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone. And then the temporal process. We talked about the temporal bone. Okay, so this area right here is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So the temporal process of the zygomatic bone is going to be extending towards the temporal bone. So again, we have the zygomatic bone, the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone, and then the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So right here is the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone and temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Now we're going to move into another bone that makes up the skull. This would be the parietal bone. And you have two parietal bones because there's the left parietal bone and the right parietal bone. This is the frontal bone. This is the occipital bone. So in this diagram, you can see the right temporal bone. You can see the frontal bone. You can see this is the right parietal bone. This is the frontal bone. This is the right temporal bone. And then here is the occipital. This is looking at it from the lateral view, but showing you the left side. You have the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the temporal bone, and the occipital bone. All right, so now let's move into the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone, as you can see, it's a very small bone and it's going to provide structure for the tear apparatus, and it pretty makes up the formation of the medial wall of the eye socket. So within the lacrimal bone, you can see right here that this region is the lacrimal bone. It's more clear if you see it from the lateral view. And within the lacrimal bone, hopefully you can see the indent right here. This opening right here, this little concave surface, this is the lacrimal fossa. And the lacrimal fossa is going to be as a site for the tear drainage right here. So this is the lacrimal fossa. All right, so now let's move into the lower jaw, which is the mandible. So your mandible is the lower jaw, and it's going to support the teeth, facilitate movement of the jaw so that you can chew, you can talk, and it also contributes to facial expression as well. So again, this mandible actually forms a crucial part of your face. It forms like the lower third of your face. And within the mandible, I want to point out three main regions first. So the biggest region right here, this entire area, this is pretty much the body of the mandible. And then this angle is the mandibular angle. And this region right here is the mandibular ramus, and then this portion right here is the mandibular condyle. So again, we have the mandibular angle, which separates the body of the mandible to the mandibular ramus, and then we have the mandibular condyle right here. And the mandibular condyle, it's going to articulate with the temporal bone. So you can see right here, the mandibular condyle, it's connected to the temporal bone. And it's when it's connected to the temporal bone, it's going to help open and close the jaw. And again, the mandible, it's very important that this bone is growing properly throughout childhood, because any abnormal growth in the mandible is going to play a role in facial asymmetry. Now, this is the mandibular condyle. This is the coronoid process right here. So mandibular condyle and coronoid process. This coronoid process is a bony projection, and it's going to protrude up, and it's going to attach to the temporalis muscles, which we'll study later, and it also helps with chewing and other function as well. And then this area right here in between the coronoid process and the mandibular condyle, this right here is the notch. So this is the mandibular notch. And then if you take a look, right here, there's this hole right here called the mandibular foramen. And again, since it's an opening, this is going to be the entry site of many nerve and blood vessels that is going to provide innervation movement to your lower lips, your chin, and your oral tissue. Now, on the medial view of the temporal bone, there is an indent. There is a divot right here. This is called the mental foramen. And the mental foramen, as you can see right here, is going to be a it actually serves as a site where more nerve goes in and out. So particularly the alveolar nerve and the mental vessels. So these nerves that are going through the these nerves that are going through the mandibular foramen, right here, the mandibular foramen. This is the mental foramen, this is the mandibular foramen. So just like the other ones, the nerve and blood vessels that go through this foramen right here is also going to help supply movement to the lower lips, the chin, and the surrounding tissues as well. Now, with the mandible, if we take a closer look at the mandible again, we can see the alveolar margin and the alveoli. So now the alveolar margin, it's the ridge of gum, and the alveoli, it's the socket where the teeth actually protrudes out. So you got the alveolar margin and the alveoli. The alveoli are the actual socket that houses the teeth. All right. And also, I want to go back and show you this part right here. Hopefully, you can start to connect the picture as you are studying. So, if we take a look at the mandibular condyle, hopefully, as you're studying, you can see that the mandibular condyle. And if you take a look at this diagram right here, the mandibular condyle, it's attaching to the temporal bone. And remember the mandibular fossa, that divot that we see next to the external acoustic meatus of the temporal bone, that is where the mandibular condyle is going to attach to. That's going to help serve with movement of the jaw. All right, so now let's go ahead and examine the sphenoid bone. Now, when you see the sphenoid bone, please do not get intimidated. I understand that it looks like a very weirdly shaped bone, but the sphenoid bone is going to be the bone that is forming the base of the cranium. It's going to sit behind the eye, and it forms the front part of the brain. Now, with the sphenoid bone, if you take a look at this diagram, you can look at it from the anterior view, the side view, which is the lateral view. You can look at it from the inferior view and also the superior view. For today, we're going to focus on examining the sphenoid bone from the anterior view and the superior view. So if someone were to look down on your skull, this would be right here, the superior view. This is looking up at your skull. So this is the inferior view. So if you were to take a look at someone and do like an x-ray so that you can see through a good chunk of their skull and facial muscles and go directly to the sphenoid bone, this right here, this image, it's a view of the anterior view of the sphenoid bone. So this is looking at someone directly in the front. So this is the anterior view. Now, with the anterior view of the sphenoid bone, you can see some wings. These are going to be the easiest one to see. You have a greater wings, actually two greater wings. These are going to be the bigger wings. And then you can also see the lesser wings right here. So this is the greater wings and the lesser wing. The greater wing is going to help form the base and side of the skull. It contributes to the orbital cavity, and it's going to be a site for various muscles, attachment muscles and ligaments. We are also going to examine that within the greater wings, there are more tiny holes that are there to allow for the passageways of vessels and nerves. Then we also have this lesser wing, as mentioned before, and this is going to serve as a site where optic nerve and artery goes in and out. So this is going to be heavily involved in the ability to see. And on the bottom here, we have these lay extension. These are called the pterygoid process. And these pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone is actually a bony projection. It extends downwards from the sphenoid bone, and pretty much it is going to be made, if you see, there are two plates that are coming off of it. So 1, 2, 1, 2. These are the pterygoid process. And then we have the sphenoid sinus. The sphenoid sinus are these opening right here, and the sphenoid sinus is super important because there are going to be the olfactory nerve that goes in and out of here. And there's also some of that carotid artery that runs through here as well. And the carotid artery is the blood vessel that supplies oxygenated blood to your brain. And then we have the optic canal. Now the optic canal, you can see the hole right here on this side, but the optic canal can actually be seen from this view as well. So the sphenoid bone is essentially right here. If you look at it articulated, where it's still attached to the skull, this right here is disarticulated. Now in the attachment, you can see that this is the optic canal. So this is where optic nerves are going to travel through to transmit light signal from your retina and take it all the way to the brain for processing. So this is the nerve vessel that essentially leaves the back part of your eyes and go to your brain. There's also some artery that runs through this optic canal as well. And then you can also see two slits. The superior orbital fissure is right here, and this is the inferior orbital fissure. You can see the superior and the inferior right here. So these two slits serves as passage site as well for many nerve and for many vessels that runs through here. Okay, so there's going to be nerve, arteries, veins that runs through here, and it's going to travel through these slits as well. So a lot of slits and a lot of opening within these sphenoid bones for communication. Now, from the superior view, okay, so here we're only examining the sphenoid bone from the anterior view, which is looking at it from the front, and from the superior view, which is looking down on the skull. From the superior view, there are structures that you can still see, but there are new structures that were not visible before. The structures that were visible before, though, are the lesser wings. You can still see the lesser wing looking downwards. You can see the lesser wing right here. There's still the greater wing on this side. Okay. The stella turcica is something that is only found by looking at it from the superior view down. Actually, it's much more clear when you see it from the superior view pointing down. Now, the stella turcica, it's actually a bony depression. So it actually extends downward to the base of your brain, and this is important because within the stella turcica, this is where your pituitary glands are stored. These pituitary glands are these endocrine glands that's going to release hormones. So this gland is stored and protected right here by the stella turcica. And what you can also see here are three tiny holes that were not visible before. So these three tiny holes, they have the word foramen in the front. So this hole right here that you can see, this is the foramen rotundum. The bigger hole here, that is called the foramen ovale. And then the smallest hole here, that is called the foramen spinosum. Okay. Now, the foramen rotundum, this hole right here, is going to allow the maxillary nerve to travel through. The foramen ovale right here is going to allow the trigeminal nerve to travel through. And then the foramen spinosum right here is again going to allow more arteries and veins to travel through, the meningeal one, which are going to supply nutrients to the meninges. All right, so now another bone in the face is going to be the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is essentially a very square bone that's found at the root of the nose, and it forms the part of the cranium, and it has many perforation, and there are going to be tiny holes in the ethmoid bone that allows for olfactory nerve to go in and out. So this is how we perceive smell. The ethmoid bone will look different depending on which view you're examining it in at. So this is the anterior view of the ethmoid bone. So this is what you see here. This is the superior view looking downwards. This is the posterior view looking at the brain from the back. So let's examine the anterior view. With the anterior view of the ethmoid bones, you can see the cristogale. The cristogale is a tiny bony ridge, and it's located right here. It is pretty much the primary site that many muscles attach to, and because of that, it's going to separate the left and right side of the brain. It helps forms the two cerebral hemisphere. So this right here is the cristogale. Then we have this plate called the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate can better be seen from the superior view, as I'll show you in a couple of minutes, and there are going to be these tiny holes in the cribriform plates where the olfactory nerve travels through. This right here is the orbital plate. So if you take a look right here where the ethmoid bone is still intact with the skull, this is the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. Because remember, this entire thing here is the orbital cavity. So if the ethmoid bone is right here, this formation where it forms that orbital plate, it's the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. And then you have the superior and the inferior nasal concave, which I can actually show you a better image from the medial view. And then you have the perpendicular plate right here. The perpendicular plate is going to be involved with separating your nose. So this forms the nasal septum. Remember the bone that I showed you on the bottom part right here? That was the vomer bone. But the ones on top of it, this is the perpendicular plate. So the perpendicular plate does not run all the way down. The bone that's in the lower region, that is the vomer bone. All right, so from the superior view of the skull, you can still see that this is the ethmoid bone right here, the squarish bone. The cristogale, the thing that protrudes up, is right here, and this entire flat area, this is the cribriform plate, this entire flat area. And the holes that you see that are forming within the cribriform plate, these holes are the olfactory foramen. So this is where the olfactory nerves are going to travel in and out, or travel through, so that the nerve can take what we smell, send it to the brain in order for us to process our smell. And it's going through these holes right here, these olfactory foramen, which takes the olfactory nerves through. And now from the side view of the brain, we can see the superior middle nasal concave. in more view, in actually a more detail. So concave are these scroll-like bones. They actually form like a scroll, so that when air travels through them, air is actually slowed down so that the air can get warmer, so you're not breathing in cold air. Without the nasal concave, the air would just travel from your nose all the way in. And there's no slowing down of the passageway, so that whenever you breathe in cold air, you actually feel a sharp sensation within your lungs. So, to prevent that, you have these bones. You have the superior and middle nasal concave of the ethmoid bone. So, this is the superior nasal concha, this is the middle nasal concha, and concave is just plural. And then you can see right here that this is the perpendicular plate and the vomer bone is on the bottom. Only the top portion is the perpendicular plate. Now we have the superior and the middle nasal concave. All of that is a part of the ethmoid bone, and along with in addition to the perpendicular plate. Now you can also see another concave on the bottom. This lower concave is not a part of the ethmoid bone. This right here is the inferior nasal concave. It's this region right here. Notice that it's not a part of the ethmoid bone. And you can see the inferior nasal concave right here on the side. So again, this right here is the inferior nasal concave. It is not a part of the ethmoid bone. The superior and the middle ones are, but the inferior nasal concave, it's a bone by itself. And again, it's also a scroll shaped pear bone, and it's going to rest on and as you can see, it actually rests on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And similar to the functions of the other concave, it's going to help warm up and filter and humidify the air that we breathe in. All right, I will see you in the next video for part 2 of the axial bone.